So raise your hand if you've been to therapy before. Or maybe if you're driving, just keep your hand on your wheel. That's totally fine. But my first time, if I'm remembering correctly, it was a few months after my dad died when I was in my mid-20s. And my college roommate set me up with her aunt, who was a renowned psychoanalyst. And she also happened to be Asian. And now that it's been decades since that first time, I've had so many more experiences with so many more therapists, all of whom have been white. I realize how rare and fortunate it was for me to have had that experience of a therapist who culturally understood me. And I really think that that played a formative role in my own understanding of my relationship with myself, with my parents, self care, success, my place in the world. I mean, you name it.
Yeah, and if you've never had the experience of having therapists who are the same race as you might really get this visceral sense of relief that we were talking about. This, sort of unspoken understanding that can, not always, but often exist in those spaces of similarity. I think it's played a huge part in the relationship that Sarah, you and I have had as multi-ethnic daughters of one Japanese immigrant parent and one white American parent each, because there are just some things that we don't have to explain to each other. For example, how we don't show up empty-handed when we visit each other or, any other house, our relationship with our parents, and also related, what we have had to unlearn when it comes to parenting our own kids. And, obviously we could go on.
Totally. I mean, I think that's why when we learned about a whole mental health support system, one we've come to learn doesn't have to include just therapists, but can be a whole system of community support that is centered on Asian Americans. In this case, we really wanted to seize the opportunity to talk about culturally responsive care and what it means to work on ourselves to be better people and more. Welcome to the last episode of the Dear White Women podcast. You curious about why this is the last one? Well, stay right tuned to this very station that you're subscribed to, because you'll get to listen in to our next episode for more. Well, hello. Will you please introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Susan Lee. I am the executive director of Yellow Chair Collective, as well as the co-author of the book Where I Belong, Healing Trauma and Embracing Asian American Identity. Thank you so much for having us.
Hi, my name is Linda Yoon. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, therapist, and founder of Yellow Chair Collective, which is Asian American focused mental health counseling group in California, Oregon, Washington, New Jersey, and New York, in 5 states right now. And Sujan and I actually also co-founded a nonprofit, which is called Antoine Community, where we focus on serving the under-resourced Asian American or other multicultural groups in mental health and then support and education.
I'm so glad that you introduced yourselves. Here we are, Mental Health Awareness Month, AAPI, like we're Asian American Heritage Awareness Month, and we're excited that you are here to help us set the stage, because this summer we're planning to dive into conversations about how to be a better person. And I feel like you're the perfect people to help me even figure out the answer to this question. Like, what does it even mean, especially from a mental health professional's point of view, to be a better person?
I feel like, you're saying we might be the best people to be talking about
No pressure.
Yeah, right. It's really funny though, because Linda and I feel like in our personal lives, not just as professionals, but just like as friends or just as community members, right? We've explored this thought and ideas in ourselves too, where we were talking about, I wish we were better human beings sometimes. We're influenced so much with everything that's happening around the world and feeling helpless and hopeless sometimes too. And so from that perspective, I wish that we could be better human beings, and maybe then the world might look a little different if we all were just a little better.
I have a few thoughts going in my head. It's very philosophical, right? And existential. I don't know we will have answers for, because the beauty of it is, there's no right answer, right? Or there's no one answer. And for me, Susan, I think we have a lot of ideas of what a good person or how we should live life that is inherent from, like everybody does, inherit from our families, our society, what we are influenced from, community. And I have a perfect pictures, like my ideal kind of like me. And then that's kind of like my version of like a better person. But I feel like it's a perfection pictures that I have in stories. So like when there are situations that come out like it doesn't seem like it fits ideal how I want to live, they are based on my values. We do struggle and then question like, how do I align more with my values? And there's this perfect picture of me, like how to be a perfect person is that even achievable. I think it's kind of like when we think about this perfection picture and perfection of like how to live, it feels kind of like out there. But then when I think about more values, kind of like, oh, okay, I have these values and I want to live according to it because they will make me feel aligned. That feels a little bit more grounded. But I think it's always a struggle between two or kind of like try to make it like, how do we integrate all that? So that's my question, long way question of your answer. How do we be better person? I don't know, but I think it does help when we know our values and then live aligned with the values. And that I want to trust that people have good values that is for the people, for the world.
Okay, this conversation is already making me feel better in certain ways because I think you highlight some of the really difficult things about life in general, right? And trying to live our values and also being faced with, this ideal of perfectionism, which, I feel like is also very cultural in some ways, and how we, kind of create and move through life, right? Even when there are big and heavy things too. And how do we hold on to hope and how do we continue to strive for being a better person? I grew up in a family which is, I have a Japanese immigrant father, and we did not talk about mental health. Like it is not, it was not a thing. And my family in Japan, we never talked about mental health. And so, can you tell us a little bit more about how and why you created Yellow Chair Collective?
So Yellow Chair Collective, I think, kind of starts even before we actually started. Sujin and I met and working at a community mental health where we serve socioeconomically disadvantaged Asian Americans, mostly immigrants and refugees from East Asia, Southeast Asia, particularly. And we saw so much gap. There is so much stereotypes around in amount of minorities, Asians are fine, they're high achieving, right? And then there's this whole population of Asian immigrants and refugees who are just invisible and who are not getting enough attention, help that they need. And even, people who are doing better socioeconomically, like mental health is such a thing that was so stigmatized. Like I and Sujin, we have a lot of personal stories how that mental health was not a thing growing up, right? So we definitely have grown our passion and love for our own community, serving Asian American community in how do we start having conversations or help people feel more comfortable with connecting their wellness, mental health, etc. In terms of color yellow, that's my favorite color. Sometimes people come and they're like, "Oh, I love how you're reclaiming the color." Like, did it mean that way? I mean, if that's empowering to you, that is totally fine. Like, doesn't mean to be racialized. Not that it didn't cross my mind, but it's been my favorite color since I was younger. For me, it was very comforting color that was like sun and moon, hope, resilience, joy. And in actually Asia, right, where the yellow is not racialized, it's a color of a lot of celebration in for many countries, a lot of innocence, a lot of celebration, joy, childlikeness. Somehow it became racialized, and then someone told me like, you're holding back because you feel like the yellow will be racialized, and that itself is racist because you cannot like a color because of this stereotype that has been put in. So I want to spread some joy, hope, and resilience that yellow presented for me personally and in our Asian country too. And just symbolically, in some ways, when I started my practice, the first chair I got was yellow chair. So it was like my therapist chair. It was like bright yellow, and then everybody made comments about like, "Wow, that color is very bright, and I like it." So that's kind of where I started.
I think, like Linda mentioned, the whole idea around the Yellow Chair Collective is to bridge the gap in mental health services. I mean, Sasha, you were mentioning about how mental health was so stigmatized, in your own household, and the narratives that we have about mental health as Asian Americans are so limited, right? The resources and the knowledge we have around it is so limited. And so we just wanted to approach mental health or wellness topics in a way that feels digestible for each individual and community members. And so Linda and I began talking about not just for our own clients that we were working with at the time who were refugees and immigrants, but we were also saying like, if we wanted to get our parents, our own immigrant parents, therapists, who could we go to for that? Who could we ask for? And there really wasn't a lot of those resources. And so we are doing a lot of not just individual work, but community care work as well as part of educating the community around what wellness or mental health can even look like. That feels really different than the Western lens, the traditional Western psychology lens.
That is fascinating. You said digestible pieces. And can we spend a moment just taking a step back and going back to basics and ask sort of what are some of the challenges that people go to therapy for? Psychoanalyst, what is all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think therapy, what people come to therapy for, or what we see most of, are just when you're having a challenge in life. I think we can always use more support because we aren't meant to solve issues alone. And oftentimes, the issues that we're dealing with, even though it feels like it's our own individual challenge, oftentimes it's very relational because it's the social message that we have internalized that we're struggling with internally, or it's the way that we're relating to the world, or the way that we're relating to our family members, or our colleagues, or our friends that are actually causing us a lot of harm or a lot of pain internally for us. And so I think my role as a therapist is supporting those elements of all of these social hurts, hurtful messages that we have internalized, to dissect those and rediscover a way to relate to the world differently, and for the world to relate to me differently too. So that's a very, very, vague way. But you have also asked various different questions of like, okay, there's a therapist, there's a psychologist, there's a psychiatrist. What are all these roles, right? And yes, there's different licenses, but at the end of the day, a therapist, I think, is helpful in just navigating through many, many different challenges of life that may be relational or mental, emotional. A psychiatrist in particular helps you to find a chemical balance again through medication. So therapists may be providing skills and tools by talk therapy, but other types of therapy too, to find yourself again and align yourself again. Whereas a psychiatrist will support through the chemical imbalance that your brain might be experiencing, which flows through all parts of your body, right? And then a psychologist, and this is very particular to specific types of psychologists too, they might be able to help discover a more clear clinical words, what we call diagnoses, for what your suffering looks like. And so they might do what's called set of different assessments to help you to figure out, okay, am I suffering from this because I have ADHD? Or is it I'm suffering from this because I have anxiety? Am I suffering from this because I have depression? Or am I suffering from this because I am neurodivergent, perhaps? Things like that. So kind of differentiating a little bit more clinically the lens in which my brain likes to absorb the world.
Oh, you said it beautifully. I don't want to mess it up.
Susan, really, the way that you described why people would come to therapy might have been one of the best explanations that I've ever heard. It really resonated so much. So thank you for sharing that. Then on top of that, we alluded to it a little bit earlier on. We talk about communities that have been overlooked, this idea of having Asian folks understand the culture from which we, approach some of these problems and the relationships and the relational challenges we might have. What does that term culturally responsive care mean, and what does it offer to people who experience it, both positives and negatives? Are there any drawbacks to something like that?
That takes me like a few days ago. We get this question once in a while, especially we primarily focus on Asian American clients, although we do accept other clients who resonate with our messages and our values. So someone was asking, so is there does it make a difference if you have someone who's Asian? Like that person was Asian and had a white therapist, it was helpful. And I'm like, yeah, Sujin and I both actually, when we first started our own therapy, there was not even an option for Asian therapists. So we had to have really nice white therapists who did really help us, right? But both our stories, we have reached a limit where they have helped us so much and then took us places that we needed during that season of life. However, we start to really feel a little bit of, I would say, barrier wall when we really start to get deeper into my family, like problem, family concerns, generational, because it's so deeply rooted in my culture, deeply rooted in to languages sometimes. And that's when I start to feel kind of that barrier of like, oh, I love my therapist. I don't necessarily want to change, but I don't know. This is not starting to not work. I think I still remember kind of like you, them being really confused. Why can't you say that to your parents? Why can't you just put a boundaries, right? Things like that kind of added to me. Even they may not have said it verbally. That was kind of like where things are being implied. And just, at one point you kind of get tired, like, oh, just trying to explain or educate about your culture, and that's not quite your job. Maybe there will be things, that you will have to explain because no one's gonna be perfectly aligned with you, everything. But like you're constantly finding yourself trying to explain the culture aspects, dynamics. That's kind of, more common in your culture. That's not really helpful anymore, right? And then I think doing anti-Asian hate crimes were like on a rise. There's this relief of seeing someone else who looks like you and knowing like you're going through it too, right? And you don't have to say a lot. And there's sometimes that presence of like, you look like me, I look like you, I know what's happening, right? Like, although we don't want to make assumption, but there is this like a presence that you can hold. So culturally responsive therapy can be different ways for different people, but generally that's kind of where we define it. Like, hey, like, is your provider able to kind of understand your culture without you keep constantly educating? You know, if you have a linguistic needs, even you may speak English as your primary language, but some of the rooted, like maybe trauma or dynamics or identity is rooted in your language. At least can you throw that language and can the provider understand, right? Or just like, experiences, there's so many socio-political things always happening, right? And then closely related to race and ethnicity culture too. So like if that's something like that is happening, do you feel like safe with your own provider can hold that space for you? So I'll kind of define that.
One of my favorite answers to this is for a lot of providers, like if they practice some kind of play therapy, game is utilized to heal children very often. But in a traditional talk psychology and therapy world, the way that you speak to one another is how you find healing. It's like you have to be verbalizing in order for you to find healing. And if it's not verbalized, it's like as if we cannot find health anymore. However, when we go back to our own traditional Eastern, like medicine and ancestral healing, very oftentimes words may or may not be involved. Language may or not be involved. Verbalization of our feelings may or may not be involved in finding healing. And so to be able to accept all sorts of healing can occur and exist, whether that's mental, emotional health or physical health, that can all exist. And each individual can find healing differently. I think that's part of cultural responsive care.
Thank you both for that. I think it's especially for people who had never really thought about what that looks like or how that shows up differently for different people. I think that's such a helpful, definition or explanation of the power of culturally responsive care. And I want to ask, because we had talked about it a little bit before, coming from communities that have, when I talk to my peers who are my own age, right, they feel therapy is something that's commonly discussed and it's much more openly discussed. And then if I were to talk to, older relatives, that would just still, there's a huge wall up around, mental health or discussing it or being open to the concept of therapy at all. And so I'm so curious, but how does this practically work in the Asian community or similar communities to this, which has been one that's been so resistant to therapy and mental health discussions in the past?
Yeah, one of the things that I want to mention is, the resistance that's there because that's always been there for a very long time. It speaks to a part of their identity that is being challenged. Is I think what I want to try to say, right? And so if we actually just try to apply into like, all right, your identity has been wrong this whole time, and we're trying to make you look at something that is different and better. Why can't you look at it? It's probably not gonna work. And so that maybe we're even playing into the resistance even more, right? For them to turn away even more. And so the way that Linda and I have been really approaching the community with the subject is many different layers. But number one is first just acknowledging where they are at in their own healing process and their journey and their own understanding of society, their own understanding of their identity and their worldview. We have to enter into their worldview first in order for us to really explore different ways that we can even see the world together. And so we acknowledge that when we enter into especially the older first generation communities, that there might be limits and some may or may not eventually get to a place of quote unquote traditional therapy. And so how do we do that? One of our favorite events in the year is what we put together, this thing called a wellness retreat. And we try to put it together as an intergenerational healing wellness retreat where we introduce traditional methods of healings like Tai Chi. We live in Los Angeles, California, where if you go to the parks in the San Gabriel Valley on Sunday mornings, all the immigrant community members of elderlies, you'll see all sorts of different communities that are just there as a group and doing Tai Chi or moving together. Or they have like different walking groups of elderlies at the parks, right? And so that we acknowledge that that is a part of mental health care. And so we don't want to separate what they're already doing. And so if we want to introduce certain concepts of mental health, we start from a place of where they are, what is acceptable for them, what already exists for them in their life.
I feel like I have been schooled a little bit on how to be a little more gentle and humble, but I feel like it's a concept that I can apply even just to my children, let alone like talking to elders about their mental health and meeting people where they are and seeing what they're already doing that is working is a really helpful way to continue to encourage folks to build up their skills of taking care of themselves. You know, you mentioned movement, and I know just from my own lived experience and research, obviously being in our bodies, moving, being around community, those are really good things for our mental health. What are some of the basic things? What other things do we need to do to support our own mental health? And if we can, the mental health of other people?
We always remember it's a holistic way of everything's interconnected, right? If we take care of our body, we feel better too, we eat better too, and that leads to emotions, and then we are able to sometimes see things more positivity, right? Hopeful, right? We feel better in our body too. So they're all interconnected, not with neglecting any levels of care or any levels of needs that we have. And being able to kind of support that in the community too. And I think when people kind of look at therapy as the only healing tool, it is so wrong, right? There's so many ways to heal and so many wisdom that our cultures already have. So kind of looking into more like strength perspective, like what do they already have? What do we have as a family or what do we have as community? And kind of really acknowledging that and then affirming. I think that's an easier way to say. But I also want to acknowledge it is sometimes hard because our mental health is impacted by our environment. And sometimes our environment and systems that we can't really change, as an individual. And sometimes takes a long time to change, even we come as a group, advocate for things. So being able to find things that is within your control and how to take care of each other, there's so many different ways you can go about it.
I think my personal journey has been there's like a sense of grief that I've had to acknowledge within myself when we're going through this journey of healing as a family unit together. Because very oftentimes, I think I've also, taught the narrative of like what a healthy family should look like. And it looks like the very like two parents, two kids in a white picket fence home, right? And they're laughing all day together. They eat meals together and they talk about their emotions. You get hugged in the morning and I love you. Have a good day, honey, right? Those like ideal family. I grew up with those sitcoms that are telling you that this is what a healthy family looks like. My immigrant family household did not look like that, right? My immigrant father never said, I love you. He would not touch me. Like he would not hug me. It just wasn't part of our family love language. And learning and discovering, okay, here are some of the societal narratives that I have received that are not applicable for my life. And also acknowledging, I wish I could have had that too. And so there was some of that grief journey too. But at the end of the day, finding what works for me and my family was the key in just like escaping from these narratives. And part of that was finding fun again. For me, it was like finding games and fun back into my life and back into my family's life. Like we integrated some of our traditional Korean games that we used to play when we were back in Korea. And when we immigrated, we lost those because we were just too busy surviving or whatever, X, Y, and Z, right? And so as an adult, for holiday parties, we'll play, like we now have a traditional game that we play as a family unit together, and we bet on quarters, like fun things. And these people may not associate this with direct therapy per se, but it is part of the therapeutic healing journey for us in myself and my own family unit.
That's such an important reminder because I do think people think mental health and sort of draw a direct line to therapy and it kind of ends there. But you're absolutely right. If we broaden what supporting our mental health looks like, especially considering that it may be different for everyone and what you need in one situation, and it's relational, right? How you can support each other within your family unit is very different than what it may look like, with a friendship, with in your professional life, whatever. So I'm really glad that you were able to touch on that. I think we could obviously sit here for 4 more hours and have this conversation, first of all, but what haven't we asked you that you think is important to share with our listeners?
Maybe Linda, do you want to talk a little bit more about our book? Because that's a really great tangible resource that we would love to share to the community.
Yeah, I can start a little bit about why the book was written. So now there's a lot of resources, which is amazing. Like I love supporting other Asian American authors who are talking about it. A lot of Asian American therapists writing books now, mental health. There's more conversations around it and they're more accepted. Older generation, there's still challenges. We understand that. We see it. However, before the rise of Asian hate crimes and pandemic and then some support that we have received and more awareness, racial reckoning, however people call it, there really wasn't any resource. There really barely any resource. And I remember when Susan and I were studying to be therapists or even after we became a therapist and working with this immigrant and refugee population, like where are books written about Asian mental health for us, Like there was not. So, and the opportunity came to us when we are growing our Yellow Chair Collective team and also our nonprofit because we saw the need of really making mental health accessible, culturally responsive for our community. And it was such a busy time. We just opened a nonprofit, growing fast, and we were doing a lot of pro bono work too and a lot of community education. And someone came up to us and, hey, like what you're doing should be a book. And initially we were like, do we have time? But at the end, like if we can write this book, right? Like we may have to work less, hopefully, in some ways. And it will be a resource because people are asking us all the time, like, is there anything I can give to my friend or my mom because they're not ready to come to therapy, they're not ready to come to support group, but they'll read a book or they will watch a video, right? So that's kind of where I belong, healing trauma and embracing Asian American identity book came to. It is kind of based in the support group that we are running. We are running Asian American Experience Group and kind of exploring what Asian American means, identity, mental health, kind of connecting all that together with context, because context was really important that people didn't understand why things were happening, why they're feeling that was not spoken or visually discussed about, but that societal implication or generational implication that we all carry within ourselves and then was manifesting but didn't know. So we were hoping to give words to that, and then we were hoping to process together and support together. So this book has a lot of stories of people, also a lot of education, historical context, and also psychoeducation where around psychology, trauma, and exercises on mental health exercises, grounding techniques, reflective prompt on your own journey to find that your own healing for you. I want to emphasize that I know the book was supposed to be meant to be like a group, so like sharing piece and then experimental piece. And sometimes when we hear from other people like, oh, it didn't really help me, it was great stories now, but it didn't help me because I didn't do the exercises. And then the people who actually done the exercises and then reflective, like they're like, wow, like it was not like real life changing. Hopefully our book is life changing for a lot of people. So I want to encourage people not to skip your reflection because that is where the real change happens for individual level.
Linda giving homeworks to people. Do your exercises. To summarize really quickly, our book is being part of a group. Like Linda mentioned, we wanted the journey of your story being reflected off of other people and other people's story feeding into yours. And so the book allows you to see yourself as being part of the community. And so that's what the book is about. I hope that'll be helpful for a lot of folks.
Yeah, I just want to add, right now, the times like this, been an interesting time for Asian American community too. I think there was a lot of solidarity coming together, solidarity during the anti-Asian hate crimes, right? And then things kind of died down, not getting attention anymore. We are entering a new political era too, right? And then we see, unfortunately, not much as community together, but people are saying, right? And then I think it's because we just focus on differences, right? And then there has not a narrative to pit Asian ethnic groups against each other too, which kind of keeps us apart, right? In the book, we were really intentional because Asian American is not monolith, and our identity stories are not the same, and really highlighting diversity that we do have while we staying core of as a community who we are, what brings together. So that's kind of also in our book that we want to kind of put it out there.
I love that. If people want to find your book and find out more about your work, where can they go?
So you can find all of our information on our website, yellowchaircollective.com. If you have any social platforms like Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, we're on all of those. We also have a podcast as well. You can find us on any of the podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube as well. Yeah. It's called The Yellow Chair Collective, the podcast. So very easy to find. But again, all those informations are all available just on our website, yellowchaircollective.com, including the book information as well.
Thank you so much for taking this time in such a busy period to meet with us and talk about all of these things. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you so much for having us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've just listened to the Dear White Women podcast with your hosts, Sarah and Misasha. Yes, we're on social media, and yes, you can hire us to do talks about our book, but the biggest thing, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter to receive our free materials. Head over to dearwhitewomen.com to get on the list.